When you close your eyes and picture a medieval prison, what do you see? Perhaps dark, damp stone walls, barred windows that let in only slivers of light, and men in chains groaning in the shadows. But beyond the clichés of rattling shackles and gloomy dungeons lies one of the most overlooked questions of survival: what did prisoners actually eat? To understand this, you must first imagine the world of the medieval jail, as it was called in England, or the carcer, in Latin, across Europe. Unlike modern prisons, which are overseen by governments and supported by taxpayer money, medieval prisons were largely the responsibility of the sheriffs, constables, or even private individuals who held authority in a town. In fact, imprisonment was rarely a punishment in itself. It was more often a temporary holding space, a liminal zone where accused criminals waited for trial, debtors lingered until they paid off what they owed, and political prisoners endured indefinite captivity until their fate was decided. And within these walls, food became not only a matter of survival but also a matter of class, privilege, and negotiation. Prisoners in medieval Europe were not automatically guaranteed meals. In many cases, the sheriff or warden of the prison provided food only if the prisoner could pay for it. Yes, you paid for your own survival while locked away. This concept was known as garnish, essentially a fee extracted by the jailers. If you were poor, you relied on the mercy of your family, your friends, or charitable donations from the community. Wealthier prisoners, meanwhile, could arrange to have meals sent in from taverns, markets, or even their own kitchens if their households were nearby. So what did these meals look like for the poor? Bread was the foundation. Coarse, dense, often stale bread, made from barley or rye rather than the fine white wheat bread that wealthier people enjoyed. Alongside it, prisoners received water, or, more often, ale. Ale was the safer choice in medieval Europe, since water was easily contaminated. Even the cheapest ale had been boiled during brewing, which killed off many harmful microbes. Thin, weak, and sour, this small ale was what kept many prisoners alive. But bread and ale alone could not sustain the body. Many prisons had what was called a commons, a meager daily allowance of food sometimes funded by the local lord or municipality. This might include a small piece of cheese, a bowl of pottage, essentially a thin stew made of grains, peas, or beans, or, if luck was with you, a scrap of salted meat. Yet the portions were pitiful. For example, in 14th century England, records show that some prisoners received a daily ration of just a pennyworth of bread and a gallon of ale. A penny may not sound like much, but it was a standardized ration, enough bread to fill one's stomach but not enough to provide real nourishment. Prisoners often remained hungry, weak, and desperate. And hunger had consequences. Malnutrition made prisoners more susceptible to disease. We must remember that prisons were overcrowded, filthy, and dark. Lice, fleas, and rats roamed freely. Prisoners slept in straw that rarely changed, in close quarters with others who might be coughing with consumption or carrying sores of leprosy. In these conditions, a poor diet of stale bread and thin broth weakened the body further, ensuring that disease spread quickly. But food was not just about survival, it was about hierarchy. Wealthy or noble prisoners lived in a very different culinary world. Consider the example of Charles of Orleans, a French noble captured at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. During his long captivity in England, he lived comfortably, dining on roasted meats, fish, spiced dishes, and fine wines. He even composed poetry, writing of his meals and experiences. For nobles like Charles, imprisonment was a loss of freedom but not a descent into starvation. the disparity between the noble prisoner and the pauper. Prisoner was stark. In the same prison, one man might gnaw on moldy crusts, while another feasted on venison pie. Food was a mirror of the social order, even behind bars. Interestingly, charity played a small but significant role. Medieval society was steeped in Christian notions of almsgiving, and providing food to prisoners was considered an act of mercy. Wealthy townspeople or church groups sometimes donated loaves of bread to local jails. On feast days, prisoners might be given extra rations, fish on Fridays, or perhaps leftover cuts of meat after a festival. These were brief reprieves, moments when hunger gave way to a rare fullness. Yet, not all prisoners were so fortunate. Debt prisons, in particular, could be cruel. Those who owed money were often kept in confinement until their debts were paid, but their survival depended entirely on outside support. Families were burdened with feeding their loved ones, and if they could not, the debtor might waste away. Accounts survive of prisoners dying of starvation, not because food was unavailable in the wider town, but because they could not afford to purchase it. As you imagine these bleak meals, picture yourself sitting in a cold stone cell. Before you, a wooden bowl holds a thin gruel of peas and oats, with a crust of coarse bread beside it. The bread is hard enough that you must dip it into the gruel to soften it. You sip from a wooden mug of sour ale, warm and flat. This is your meal, not for today only, but for days, weeks, even months on end. How long could you endure such monotony? How long before your body weakened, or your spirit began to break? This is where we begin, with the daily bread of the medieval prisoner. But food is never just food, it is politics, privilege, survival, and power. In the next section, we will explore more deeply how prisons themselves were structured to control food, and how corruption, extortion, and human ingenuity shaped the diets of those behind bars. If Section 1 showed us the bare reality of food inside medieval prisons, the bread, the ale, the gruel, then Section 2 brings us deeper into the mechanics of how those rations were controlled, distributed, and manipulated. Because in the medieval jail, food was not only survival, it was currency, power, and a tool for corruption. Imagine stepping into a medieval prison again. You walk past heavy wooden doors reinforced with iron, past narrow passageways where the smell of rot and damp stone is overpowering. At the center of the prison stands the jailer who ran the establishment. Unlike modern wardens, jailers were not paid a salary by the crown or town council. Instead, they earned their living by charging prisoners fees for everything: entry, bedding, chains, and yes, food. This system created a paradox. The jailer profited not from caring for prisoners, but from extracting as much money as possible from them. If you could not pay, you were left to beg, starve, or rely on the charity of others. This practice was called garnish, a kind of initiation fee that could include money, food, or even promises of labor. For poor prisoners, it meant arriving hungry and often staying hungry. But the jailer was not only a figure of cruelty, he was also a businessman. If you had coin, you could arrange for surprisingly good meals. Town markets and taverns often supplied prisons, with merchants bringing in bread, cheese, meat pies, and even wine. Wealthier prisoners ordered meals as if dining in an inn, while poorer ones might scrape together pennies for a handful of beans or a scrap of salted fish. The jailer facilitated these transactions, taking his cut each time. There are records from 14th and 15th century England describing precisely how much prisoners were expected to pay for food. A common allowance might be a penny for bread, a penny for ale, and a halfpenny for pottage. But these were not fixed rates, they fluctuated, depending on the greed of the jailer and the desperation of the prisoner. Inflation inside the prison walls could be far worse than in the world outside. Corruption went further still. Jailers sometimes withheld rations to punish inmates or demanded bribes in exchange for decent food. In notorious debtors' prisons, prisoners were charged not only for meals but for the very right to cook or receive food at all. If a debtor's family brought in bread from home, the jailer might demand a fee before the prisoner could touch it. Food became ransom inside a place already defined by captivity. Yet, even in this bleak environment, ingenuity thrived. Prisoners learned to stretch their meager meals. A crust of bread could be soaked in ale to soften it, making it last longer. Pottage could be bulked out with weeds or herbs smuggled in by visitors. Those lucky enough to receive gifts from family sometimes shared scraps with fellow inmates, creating informal networks of exchange. Food became part of the prison economy, traded, borrowed, hoarded, and sometimes stolen. It is worth pausing here to imagine the communal aspect of these meals. A medieval prison was rarely solitary. Cells often held multiple inmates, from petty thieves to murderers, heretics, and debtors, all crammed together. Eating was a public affair. Imagine sitting shoulder to shoulder with strangers, passing around a communal bowl of stew, each man dipping in with his own spoon or piece of bread. In such close quarters, food was never private. Diseases spread easily through shared meals. Leprosy, scurvy, and dysentery found their way into prisons, made worse by weak diets. Malnutrition led to scurvy-like symptoms, bleeding gums, rotting teeth, and open sores. Protein was scarce, vitamins were almost non-existent. A prisoner might survive months on barley bread and ale, but his body paid the price. And yet, food could also bring comfort, even dignity. On religious feast days, such as Christmas or Easter, wealthier patrons sometimes provided special meals for all the prisoners. Records tell of roast meats, fish pies, or even sweet pastries being distributed as acts of Christian charity. For one brief moment, the taste of festival food could break through the monotony of crusts and broth. The church also played a key role. Many monasteries included charitable giving to prisoners in their yearly obligations. A monk might arrive with a cart of bread or dried peas, distributing them among the jail's poorest inmates. These gifts did not end suffering, but they symbolized the belief that feeding prisoners was a moral duty. Still, we must not romanticize this charity. It was irregular and insufficient. Most prisoners spent day after day with empty stomachs, waiting on scraps or small coins from visitors. Many simply died of hunger or disease before ever facing trial. The contrast between noble and common prisoners remained sharp. Wealthy captives, especially knights or political enemies, often brought their own servants into prison. These attendants prepared meals, sometimes with spices, fresh vegetables, and fine meats. For them, prison meals could resemble banquets, albeit within stone walls. Contemporary chronicles describe noble prisoners eating roasted goose, venison, and spiced wine, while the poor beside them chewed on moldy bread. This inequality bred resentment. Petty thieves or beggars might watch as nobles dined richly within the same walls, knowing that their own lives hung on whether a passerby donated a loaf. Food revealed the stark reality of medieval society. Class and privilege did not disappear in prison, they were intensified. One of the most haunting aspects of prison food was its unpredictability. You never knew if today would bring bread or nothing at all. Some days, charity might surprise you with a hearty meal. Other days, the jailer might withhold even your crust until you paid. Hunger gnawed constantly at the mind. Prison diaries from later centuries described food dreams, visions of feasts and banquets that tortured sleeping men. It is not hard to imagine the same in the Middle Ages. As you picture these meals, imagine again being inside that stone chamber. You sit with fellow prisoners, your body thin, your stomach aching. The jailer approaches, holding a crust of bread in one hand and a small jug of ale in the other. Will you receive them? Or will he sneer and demand coin first? Your survival hangs on his mood, on the charity of others, and on your own ingenuity to stretch what little you have. In Section 1, we saw the basic diet of the medieval prisoner. Now, in Section 2, we have seen how that diet was controlled, corrupted, and turned into an economy of survival. But there is more still. What about the psychological impact of hunger? How did long periods of deprivation shape the body and mind of prisoners, and what stories survive of those who endured, or failed to endure, these diets? That will be the focus of our next section. By now, you have seen the daily meals of the medieval prisoner, the crusts of bread, the thin ale, the watery pottage. You have seen how jailers controlled the flow of food, how corruption and charity shaped who ate well and who starved. Yet, there is still one question to explore: what did this food, or lack of it, do to the body and the mind? Because a prison diet was not just a matter of taste or variety. It was about endurance, suffering, and the slow erosion of human strength. To understand this, imagine yourself surviving for months on little more than barley bread and weak ale. At first, the body manages. Bread fills the stomach, even if it is coarse and heavy. Ale quenches thirst, and the small amounts of nutrients in peas or beans from pottage provide minimal energy. But soon, the deficiencies appear. Without fresh vegetables or fruits, vitamin C is nearly absent. Scurvy begins its cruel work. Gums swell and bleed, teeth loosen and fall, wounds fail to heal. Prisoners described ulcers on their skin, constant exhaustion, and a sense of their very flesh wasting away. Protein was rare for the poorest prisoners. Without it, muscles weakened, leaving men unable to resist illness. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and fevers swept through crowded jails. Prison diets, already insufficient, became death sentences when combined with filth and disease. Some prisons had mortality rates so high that chroniclers compared them to graveyards. The Marshalsea in London, notorious for centuries, was one such place. Debtors and criminals wasted away inside, many dying not from violence or execution, but simply from starvation and illness brought on by their rations. Food also shaped the prisoner's mind. Chronic hunger dulled the senses, creating lethargy. Prisoners grew irritable, despondent, or resigned. Accounts from later prisons describe inmates dreaming constantly of food, speaking of bread and meat in their sleep. It is not difficult to imagine the same for their medieval counterparts. For some, hunger drove desperation. Prison riots sometimes broke out, sparked by withheld rations or excessive fees for food. Jailers were attacked, and prison doors battered, not for escape but for access to bread. In these cases, food was more than sustenance, it was power, rebellion, and hope. Religion also colored the experience of prison hunger. Some prisoners accepted starvation as penance, believing that their suffering brought them closer to God. Saints' lives describe holy men and women enduring prison fasts with saintly patience, turning deprivation into a spiritual trial. Yet for ordinary prisoners, this was rarely voluntary. Hunger was simply another chain, binding them day after day. The historical record preserves glimpses of individuals who endured these diets. In 1315, during a famine across Europe, prison rations became even worse. Towns already lacked bread and grain, and prisons often received the lowest priority. Many prisoners starved outright. Chroniclers note that deaths in jails rose dramatically, with corpses piling up in cells until they were carted away. On the other hand, wealthy prisoners sometimes wrote about their meals in surprising detail. A nobleman imprisoned after a feud might describe receiving venison from his estates, or fresh fish brought from nearby rivers. These accounts remind us of the stark inequalities: two men under the same roof, one dying from hunger while another feasted. One poignant example comes from the Tower of London, where political prisoners often wrote letters during their captivity. Some complained bitterly about poor food, stale bread, sour wine, while others, who had the means, dined almost luxuriously. Even in one of the most infamous prisons of the Middle Ages, diet depended more on class than on chains. Despite hunger and corruption, food in prison retained its ritual importance. Eating was not only survival, it was the one act that broke the monotony of endless days. Prisoners looked forward to meals, however small, as markers of time. Bread and ale divided the day, giving shape to otherwise shapeless confinement. Communal meals also forged strange bonds. Sharing a crust with a fellow prisoner, or pooling resources for a shared pot of pottage, created solidarity. In these acts, prisoners resisted despair, turning meager rations into small gestures of humanity. Conversely, food could also divide. Those with money or outside support often ate apart, their richer meals setting them apart from the hungry masses. Within a prison, the inequality of the outside world was magnified by the daily reality of hunger. So, what does all this tell us about medieval prisons and their food? It tells us that food was never guaranteed. That survival behind bars depended less on law or justice, and more on money, family, and luck. It tells us that hunger was not incidental, it was central to the experience of imprisonment. And it also reminds us of the resilience of human beings. Prisoners learned to survive on crusts and broth. They found ways to stretch food, to share it, to endure the weakness and despair. Hunger shaped them, but it did not entirely break them. Finally, food in prison reflected the broader world outside. In a society built on hierarchy, privilege, and charity, those same structures determined who ate and who starved, even behind stone walls. As you let your mind rest on this image, of prisoners breaking bread in a dim, damp cell, consider the role of food in our own world. Today, meals in prisons are standardized, regulated, and debated in terms of nutrition and cost. In the medieval world, food was not a right but a privilege, one that could mean the difference between life and death. And so we close story 1, with the quiet knowledge that for centuries, survival behind bars was measured in crusts of bread and jugs of sour ale. You might think of a prison as a place ruled by law, where order is enforced by rules and punishments. But in the Middle Ages, prisons were not primarily about justice. They were businesses, enterprises that generated income for the sheriffs, constables, and jailers who ran them. And nowhere is this clearer than in the way food was handled. Step into a medieval prison once more. The stone walls are damp, the air heavy with the scent of mold and unwashed bodies. In the shadows, men huddle together, some wrapped in rags, others with nothing but the straw beneath them. At the center of this world stands the jailer. He is not a faceless official paid by the state, but a man who profits directly from his prisoner's survival. His table is always full, because it is built from the scraps of every inmate's hunger. Unlike modern prisons, medieval jails received no regular funding for food. Instead, prisoners had to pay fees for their keep. These payments covered not only bedding and chains, but also meals. The system was, in effect, legalized extortion. If you wanted food, you had to pay. If you could not, you starved. Jailers charged for everything: entry into the prison, removal of irons, access to fire, and daily rations. This created a hierarchy of survival. Wealthy prisoners lived comfortably, their tables filled with purchased goods from local markets. Poor prisoners scraped together coins for moldy bread and weak ale, if they could afford even that. The practice of garnish, a kind of initiation fee, meant that prisoners were forced to hand over money or food as soon as they arrived. Some paid in coins, others surrendered their only possessions, perhaps a cloak or belt, in exchange for meals. For the jailer, garnish was a way to establish control from the start. Food became the jailer's greatest weapon. He could withhold it as punishment, sell it at inflated prices, or use it as leverage. Hungry men were desperate men, easily bent to his will. Accounts from medieval England show that jailers often forced prisoners to beg or rely on relatives for food. If a prisoner's family brought bread or ale from outside, the jailer demanded a cut before passing it along. Some jailers even set up monopolies, arranging with local bakers and brewers to sell food only through the prison at higher prices. Corruption was not hidden, it was expected. In many towns, people accepted that the jailer grew rich from the suffering of prisoners. Complaints reached kings and councils, but reforms rarely stuck. The prison remained a marketplace of misery, with food at its center. While prisoners gnawed on crusts, the jailer himself ate well. Chronicles describe jailers feasting on meat, cheese, and ale purchased with the very coins they extracted from their captives. His table, laden with food, was a constant reminder of his authority. In some cases, jailers dined in plain sight of the prisoners. Imagine the cruelty of the scene: a jailer carving a joint of meat while men behind bars chewed on stale crusts. Hunger was sharpened not only by lack, but by the sight of abundance just out of reach. The contrast between prisoner and jailer reflected the imbalance of power that defined the medieval justice system. The man who should have been the custodian of law became the profiteer of suffering, yet, prisoners did not always accept this quietly. Resistance took many forms. Some smuggled food in through sympathetic guards or bribed servants. Others rioted when rations were withheld. There are records of prisoners attacking kitchens, seizing bread and ale in desperate revolts. More quietly, prisoners formed networks of sharing. A family might bring food for one man, and he would share with cellmates. Debt prisoners often pooled resources, buying a joint of meat or a pot of pottage together. Food became both survival and solidarity. But even these acts of defiance reinforced the jailer's power. He controlled the gates, the exchanges, the flow of food. Nothing entered the prison without passing through his hands. The jailer's table tells us much about medieval justice. It reveals that imprisonment was not designed for fairness or reform, but for profit. It shows how hunger could be used as a weapon, turning justice into exploitation. And it reminds us of the enduring role of food in human survival. Bread and ale, cheese and pottage, these simple meals were never just nourishment. They were control, corruption, and the daily reminder of who held power. In the next section, we will explore how this system of food and corruption was shaped not just by individuals, but by broader structures of law, economy, and religion. We will look at how towns, churches, and even kings tried, and often failed, to regulate prison diets, and what that tells us about medieval society at large. In the first section of this story, we saw the jailer at the heart of the prison, profiting from the hunger of his inmates. But the jailer did not operate in isolation. He was part of a broader structure, legal, economic, and religious, that shaped the way food flowed into prisons. To understand prison diets more fully, we need to step back and look at the world outside the prison walls. At its core, the medieval prison was not supposed to be a punishment. It was a place of holding, a debtor confined until repayment, a thief awaiting trial, a heretic detained until judgment. Punishments were swift and physical: fines, whippings, mutilation, or execution. Prison was liminal, a waiting room of justice. Because of this, governments rarely allocated funds for food. If you were awaiting trial, why should the crown pay to feed you? If you were a debtor, why should the town provide your meals when you owed money? The logic was circular: you were in prison because you were thought guilty or poor, and your hunger was proof of both. This vacuum of responsibility created the jailer's business model. Sheriffs and lords appointed men to run jails, granting them the right to collect fees. The jailer's livelihood came not from wages but from what he could extract. Food became one of the most reliable sources of income. Over time, some monarchs recognized the dangers. Starving prisoners before their trials undermined the appearance of justice. If men died in jail before verdicts were reached, towns lost potential fines and labor. Thus, occasional ordinances attempted to regulate prison diets. A few documents mandated commons, basic rations of bread and ale. Yet these were often vague, unenforced, or easily circumvented by greedy officials. Local towns also played a role in prison food. Many prisons were municipal institutions, funded in part by town revenues. Civic leaders worried about the reputation of their jails. A prison where men starved was not only inhumane but also dangerous. Starving men rioted, disease spread beyond prison walls. Thus, some towns set aside money for bread or beans to distribute weekly. Bakers might be contracted to provide loaves at fixed prices. Brewers might deliver barrels of weak ale. Still, the quality was usually poor. Bread for prisoners was dense and dark, made from rye or barley. Ale was thin and sour. Yet for many inmates, these were the only meals they could rely on. The town's involvement also reflected civic pride. To feed prisoners, even poorly, was to demonstrate order and control. Starving captives suggested weakness. Feeding them, however modestly, reinforced the authority of the town over its inhabitants. Perhaps the most significant external influence came from the church. In medieval Christianity, feeding the hungry was considered a work of mercy, a path to salvation. Prisoners, trapped and helpless, became natural recipients of alms. Monasteries often included food for prisoners in their charitable distributions. A monk might deliver loaves of bread, dried peas, or salted fish to the town jail. Wealthy individuals left bequests and wills, instructing executors to distribute food to the poor and the imprisoned. Feast days brought surpluses. After Christmas banquets, towns sometimes sent leftovers into prisons. This charity was irregular, but symbolically powerful. For a starving prisoner, a loaf of soft white bread donated by a church might feel like a gift from heaven. Yet almsgiving also reinforced hierarchy. The prisoner remained dependent on the generosity of others, his survival framed not as a right but as a mercy. beyond law and religion, the broader economy shaped prison diets. Grain shortages, famines, and rising prices struck prisoners hardest. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when rains ruined harvests across Europe, even free citizens struggled to buy bread. In prisons, the situation was dire. Jailers raised fees, towns rationed grain, almsgiving dried up. Thousands of prisoners starved in silence, their deaths barely recorded. Markets also influenced meals. If a prison stood near a thriving town with abundant markets, wealthier inmates could purchase better foods. Cheese, eggs, fish, and even spices might reach the jail through bribes and deliveries. But in rural or impoverished regions, even the rich had little access to variety. Location dictated diet as much as class. By the late Middle Ages, criticisms of prison corruption grew louder. Chroniclers condemned jailers for enriching themselves while prisoners wasted away. Some royal commissions investigated abuses, issuing stern warnings against overcharging for food. In England, the Statute of Westminster, 1285, attempted to regulate the treatment of prisoners, including their keep. Yet reforms were difficult to enforce. Prisons were local institutions, often hidden from oversight. A jailer's word carried more weight than a starving prisoner's complaint. Even when regulations required jailers to provide bread and ale at fixed prices, loopholes and bribes undermined them. Hunger remained endemic. Through all of this, the jailer's table stood as a symbol. His meals represented not only his personal wealth but the broader corruption of the system. The image of a jailer feasting while prisoners starved appeared again and again in literature and chronicles. It became a shorthand for injustice itself. Yet, ironically, the jailer was often trapped in his own position. Without the income from food fees, he could not support himself or maintain the prison. The very structure of the system forced him into corruption. Food was not simply his weapon, it was his survival, too. When we look at the role of food in prisons, we see more than the hunger of inmates. We see a mirror of medieval society itself, a world where law was uneven, where the wealthy thrived while the poor suffered, where charity existed but could never erase inequality. In prison, these patterns were intensified. The bread of the poor grew harder, the ale of the rich grew sweeter. The jailer's table remained full, even when cells echoed with the groans of the starving. As we move into the next section, we will look more closely at the cultural memory of prison food. How did medieval writers, poets, and chroniclers describe these meals? How did the symbolism of bread and hunger shape the way society thought about justice, punishment, and mercy? We have seen how the jailer's control of food shaped survival, how law, economy, and religion all influenced the flow of bread and ale into medieval prisons. Now, in this final section of Story 2, we turn to something quieter but equally revealing: the way prison food was remembered, described, and imagined in medieval culture. Because bread in a prison was not only sustenance, it became a symbol. Medieval writers often reduced prison meals to a single phrase: bread and water. To live on bread and water meant hardship, deprivation, and punishment. This phrase carried such weight that it entered sermons, poems, and legal documents alike. In chronicles, when describing the suffering of political prisoners, writers frequently mentioned their meager rations. They lived on bread and water, as beggars, until God delivered them. It was shorthand for misery, a way to make the reader immediately understand the bleakness of captivity. But this image was also moral. Bread symbolized humility, simplicity, the bare minimum needed to survive. Water symbolized purity, but also emptiness when compared to wine or ale. To be reduced to bread and water was to be stripped of luxury, status, and comfort. It was both punishment and lesson. Medieval poets occasionally reflected on prison diets, especially when nobles or poets themselves found their way into captivity. The French nobleman Charles of Orleans, who spent 25 years as a prisoner in England after the Battle of Agincourt, wrote verses that touched on the monotony of confinement. Though he ate far better than common prisoners, the symbolic weight of prison bread found its way into his laments. In ballads and stories, characters punished by imprisonment were often described in terms of their rations. To say a man gnawed crusts in the king's prison painted a vivid image, one that readers immediately understood. Food became a narrative device to evoke suffering. Even saints' lives used the motif. Holy men and women, unjustly imprisoned, were described as enduring hunger with patience. Their bread became a form of spiritual nourishment, their thirst a sign of faith. In these tales, the prison meal was not only literal but metaphorical, a test of endurance and piety. If bread and water symbolized suffering, then the jailer's feast symbolized corruption. Writers often contrasted the meager rations of the prisoner with the abundance of the jailer. Chronicles describe jailers drinking heavily, feasting on meats and pies, while prisoners begged for crumbs. This contrast served as moral commentary. The jailer's table represented injustice, greed, and the failure of Christian duty. In sermons, priests sometimes used this image to warn against selfishness. Do not be as the jailer, who feasts while the poor starve at his door. The prison became an allegory for society itself, with the rich growing fat and the poor wasting away, yet not all images of prison food were negative. In some towns, acts of charity toward prisoners became rituals remembered with pride. Annual festivals sometimes included donations of bread to jails, symbolic reminders that mercy must extend even to captives. Charters and wills also preserved this memory. Wealthy individuals often left money specifically for feeding prisoners. Their names, attached to loaves and bowls of pottage, lived on in local records. The act of giving food to prisoners became a way to secure both earthly reputation and heavenly reward. In this sense, prison food bridged two worlds, the dark reality of hunger and the bright hope of charity. It reminded society of its failings while offering opportunities for redemption. Perhaps most importantly, prison diets shaped how medieval people thought about justice itself. Hunger was seen as both natural and deserved. To be reduced to crusts was proof of guilt, even before trial. At the same time, excessive hunger could undermine justice, killing men before verdicts were reached. Balancing these tensions was never easy. The symbolism lingered long after the Middle Ages. Even in later centuries, bread and water punishments persisted as a way to discipline soldiers, sailors, or unruly prisoners. The medieval association between meager food and moral correction endured, embedding itself in legal and cultural traditions. When we step back and look at the jailer's table, we see more than one man's corruption. We see the way food itself became a language of justice. Bread, water, ale, and meat spoke of hierarchy, suffering, and mercy. A loaf of bread could be extortion, charity, or symbol, all at once. We also see how prisons, often hidden from public view, shaped the imagination of society. The image of the prisoner with his crust and the jailer with his feast carried moral weight far beyond the prison walls. It became a way to talk about inequality, greed, and the duties of the powerful toward the powerless. As you picture the jailer at his table, his plate piled high while the prisoners stare from the shadows, consider what this tells us about the past. Food, so ordinary in daily life, became extraordinary in prison. It revealed who held power, who suffered, and who bore the burden of justice. And perhaps, even now, the echo of that contrast remains with us, the knowledge that what we eat, or do not eat, says as much about society as it does about survival. Prison diets in the Middle Ages were never generous, but they became especially brutal during times of famine and war. In such crises, food disappeared from the markets, grain prices soared, and even free citizens struggled to survive. For prisoners, already at the bottom of society's priorities, famine meant starvation in its most literal sense. To understand this, you must picture Europe during one of its great famines, most famously, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Heavy rains destroyed harvests, livestock perished, and bread became scarce across the continent. Villages went hungry, towns rationed grain, and desperation filled the countryside. For those trapped inside prisons, the effects were magnified tenfold. Outside the prison walls, hunger had already transformed daily life. Grain markets collapsed as poor harvests drove prices sky high. A loaf of bread that once cost a penny might cost 3 or 4. Peasants could not afford it. Townspeople lined up for hours hoping for a handful of flour. Reports from chroniclers tell of families eating dogs, cats, or even roots pulled from fields. In this world, prisoners had little hope. If the free population could barely feed itself, who would spare food for those locked away? Families who once brought bread to their relatives in jail found they had none to spare. Charitable donations dried up, and even the church struggled to maintain almsgiving. Now imagine the prison itself. Its storerooms, once supplied with cheap barley or rye, are empty. The jailer, who profited from selling food, finds fewer deliveries from bakers and brewers. What little bread remains is coarse, made with pea flour, oat husks, or even ground acorns. Ale, thin at the best of times, becomes weaker still, stretched with water until it barely resembles drink. Prisoners fight over crumbs. A stale crust becomes a treasure, a shared pot of bean pottage a feast. But even beans and peas, staples of the poor, are scarce during famine. Malnutrition spread rapidly. Thin men grow thinner, sores appear on skin, and coughs echo through the cells. Chroniclers note that in some prisons, death came not from execution but from simple hunger. Corpses were carried out daily, not to the gallows but to the churchyard. Prison mortality soared, largely unrecorded, hidden behind walls. Famine was not the only crisis. War also reshaped prison diets. During campaigns, towns redirected resources toward armies, leaving prisoners with whatever scraps remained. Soldiers needed bread and ale to march, prisoners were expendable. War also brought prisoners of a different kind, captured soldiers, knights, and nobles. Their diets contrasted sharply with those of common criminals. Wealthy captives, ransomed for gold, often dined better in captivity than free peasants did outside. They ate roast meats, fish, and spiced wine, supplied by their families or even by their captors, who had every incentive to keep valuable prisoners alive. Meanwhile, ordinary prisoners, petty thieves, debtors, and accused villagers, starved beside them. The contrast was striking, one man feasting, another wasting away in the same walls. Hunger rarely came alone. In prisons, famine often paired with disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, allowing plague, dysentery, and typhus to spread unchecked. Dirty water, when ale ran out, carried infections. A prisoner might cling to life through hunger only to succumb to fever. The Great Famine itself was followed closely by waves of disease. For prisoners, this meant suffering upon suffering. Hunger hollowed their bodies, sickness finished them. In some towns, prisons emptied not through pardons or trials, but through death, yet even in famine, human beings adapted. Some prisoners bartered labor for food, mending clothes, carrying water, or working in kitchens. Others scavenged, picking crumbs from jailers' tables or collecting scraps from refuse heaps. A few dug small gardens in prison yards, planting onions, leeks, or herbs if soil was available. These efforts rarely solved hunger, but they show resilience. Even in the bleakest times, men and women searched for ways to stretch life one more day, one more meal. This first section shows how famine and war transformed already meager prison diets into instruments of suffering. The jailer's greed, the town's economy, and the church's charity all faltered in crisis, leaving prisoners with little more than husks and water. For many, famine meant death in silence. But famine also magnified contrasts, between rich and poor, between noble captives and common criminals. Inside prison walls, as outside, hunger revealed hierarchy. In the next section, we will explore more deeply the recorded stories of prisoners during famine years, the diaries, chronicles, and testimonies that tell us what it felt like to starve behind bars, and how society justified, or ignored, such suffering. In the last section, we looked broadly at how famine and war stripped medieval prisons of food, pushing already harsh diets into the realm of starvation. Now, let us step closer, into the lives and voices of people who experienced these conditions. Though prisoners left behind few words of their own, chronicles, records, and scattered testimonies reveal fragments of their suffering. These fragments, when pieced together, tell us how it felt to starve in captivity, and how society explained or justified such suffering. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 is one of the best documented periods of medieval hunger. Chroniclers from England, France, and the Low Countries recorded in sorrowful detail the misery of their times. Most accounts speak of villagers, beggars, and peasants, but a few mention prisoners. In the English annals Londinenses, a short note describes jails during the famine years. Many men perished, for the keepers had no bread to sell them, nor could families afford to bring sustenance. In Newgate the dead were carried out daily. The passage is brief, but powerful. It shows how famine cut off both sides of prison survival, the jailer's trade in bread and the family's gifts. When both collapsed, death was inevitable. In French chronicles, too, prisons appear as sites of hunger. One monk wrote of Paris, "The king's prisons were filled, but no meat, no grain, no ale was sent to them. Many wasted away, and their bones were buried without names." Such records remind us that famine did not only haunt the fields and markets, it haunted the locked chambers where the forgotten lived. We rarely hear the prisoners themselves. Most were poor, illiterate, and left no writings. Their voices are lost. Yet sometimes, through court records, their words echo faintly. In a legal petition from 1320, a widow in York begged for mercy on behalf of her husband, imprisoned for debt. She wrote that he was so feeble from want of food that he cannot stand, and that she had no bread left to bring him. Though the document's purpose was to seek release, its language gives us a glimpse of lived hunger. A man too weak to stand, a wife unable to feed him, this is famine distilled into human form. Other petitions from later famines tell similar stories. Prisoners asked not for freedom, but for bread. They begged the crown to order sheriffs to supply jails, arguing that justice could not be done if men starved before trial. Hunger became not only suffering but also legal argument. How did society explain this suffering? Many believed hunger was deserved. To be in prison was, in itself, evidence of guilt. If the guilty starved, that was God's justice. Chroniclers sometimes wrote of famine-struck prisoners with little pity, seeing their hunger as punishment from above. At the same time, theologians debated mercy. Canon law reminded Christians that all souls deserved care, even the condemned. Sermons urged the faithful to remember those in prison, quoting the Gospel of Matthew, "I was in prison, and you visited me." Hunger in jail thus became a test of society's charity. Did people remember the forgotten, or did they turn away? The answer was rarely simple. Some towns responded with charity drives, distributing bread to prisoners during famine years. Others ignored them altogether, preferring to save scarce grain for free citizens. Hunger in prisons thus reflected broader moral choices. One of the most striking features of famine within prisons was the stark divide between rich and poor captives. Wealthy prisoners, especially nobles captured in war, often dined better in confinement than peasants did in freedom. Consider the case of Robert of Bethune, a Flemish noble captured by the French in the early 14th century. Chronicles describe him being served flesh and fish, white bread and wine, while awaiting ransom. His jailers had every reason to keep him healthy, for his freedom was worth a fortune. Meanwhile, petty thieves or debtors in the same prisons gnawed at crusts of barley bread, if any bread could be found at all. The famine widened the gap. Families of nobles could still send food or money, families of peasants had nothing. Prison thus became a mirror of society. The rich endured inconvenience, the poor endured starvation. During famine years, prisons sometimes became death traps. Mortality rates soared, though exact numbers are impossible to know. Some jails may have lost half their inmates. The silence of records itself tells us much. When registers of prisoners suddenly end mid-year, or when rolls list names with the note, "Dead in jail," we glimpse the hidden toll. In many towns, prison cemeteries grew during famine years, filled with the nameless dead. Such deaths rarely stirred outrage. They were quiet, expected, and unnoticed outside prison walls. Unlike great famines in the countryside, which left visible corpses in fields and streets, prison deaths remained hidden. This invisibility may explain why they are so little recorded. Despite this, not all prisoners perished. Many found ways to stretch. Survival. Some bartered favors with jailers, giving small coins or labor in exchange for morsels of food. Others relied on religious fraternities, which sometimes organized collections of bread specifically for famine-stricken jails. In Norwich, a guild record from 1316 notes a donation, for the prisoners, 10 loaves of barley bread, to be given each Friday until Easter. 10 loaves may not seem much, but for starving men, it could mean life. Such small acts of charity kept some alive through the lean years that end this section. We have seen the human face of famine in prisons, not only in chronicles, but in petitions, in class contrasts, and in small acts of charity. Hunger was both punishment and tragedy, justified by some as divine justice, mourned by others as a failure of mercy. The prison, in famine years, became more than a place of confinement. It became a stage where society's values were tested: justice, charity, hierarchy, and survival. But we have not yet reached the end of the story. In the next section, we will explore how famine and war shaped the long-term perception of prisons themselves. Did mass starvation change how people thought about justice? Did it alter laws, policies, or attitudes toward the imprisoned? And how did memory of these crises linger in culture and imagination? We have looked at how famine and war deepened the hunger of medieval prisoners, and how chronicles, petitions, and fragments of evidence reveal their silent suffering. In this final section, we will turn to a broader view, how these crises shaped the long-term image of prisons, the lessons that were drawn from starvation, and the cultural memory that remained after the hunger had passed. By the late Middle Ages, bread and water had become more than an unfortunate reality, it was codified as a deliberate punishment. Judges sometimes sentenced offenders to subsist on bread and water for a set period, not necessarily to imprison them permanently, but to humble their bodies. This practice was inspired, in part, by the memory of famine. Authorities had seen how starvation naturally broke the spirit of prisoners during crises. It was an efficient, inexpensive punishment. To reduce a man to crusts and a jug of water was to remind him of his dependence on authority. Thus, famine's lessons were absorbed into the judicial system itself. What had once been accidental, starvation during shortages, was institutionalized as a tool of discipline. Famine also influenced how people thought about justice more broadly. Chronic hunger in prisons made clear that punishment extended beyond trial and sentence. Simply being confined during famine could mean death before verdict. This raised uncomfortable questions. Some jurists and clerics argued that starvation made justice incomplete. If a man died before judgment, his guilt or innocence was never determined. In a few cases, records show attempts to speed trials during famine years, to prevent mass deaths in jails. But such reforms were limited, and often ignored. More often, society accepted prison hunger as natural. It reinforced the idea that imprisonment itself was a kind of slow punishment, where survival depended on external mercy. Justice was not only in the courtroom, it was in the daily struggle for bread. Though famine years passed, their traces lingered in records. Jail delivery rolls, petitions, and charters contained scattered references to starvation, enough to suggest that memory of the crises endured. For example, after the Great Famine, some towns revised their charitable practices. Wills increasingly included clauses to feed prisoners. In London, several 14th-century testators left funds specifically to provide bread for jails, perhaps recalling the deaths of famine years. Hunger had impressed itself deeply enough on society that it shaped patterns of giving for generations. Monastic chronicles, too, preserved the memory. Though often brief, their mentions of prison hunger stood as moral lessons, warnings against greed, neglect, and indifference. The silent deaths of prisoners became symbols of society's failure. War added another layer to this memory. The stark contrast between noble captives dining well and common prisoners starving shaped perceptions of fairness. Even contemporaries noted the injustice. Some chroniclers mocked the irony of noble knights writing poetry over fine meals while thieves beside them perished. This contrast influenced how captivity was viewed. Noble captivity was seen almost as an extended courtly exile, while common imprisonment was synonymous with starvation. The memory of this inequality sharpened class divisions in cultural imagination. Over time, noble memoirs of captivity, often downplaying hunger, dominated the written record. But in the shadows of those texts lingered the silent memory of the starving poor. The Church, too, carried forward famine's lessons. Preachers used the image of starving prisoners to stir compassion. Sermons urged listeners to remember those in jail, especially during times of scarcity. Feeding prisoners became a recognized work of mercy, alongside feeding the poor more generally. At the same time, hunger remained associated with penance. Monks and penitents deliberately ate bread and water to imitate prison conditions. To starve, or nearly starve, was seen as a way of purifying the soul. Thus, prison hunger became both warning and model, a cautionary tale for society, and a spiritual practice for the devout. What, then, was the long-term impact of famine and war on prison diets? First, famine reinforced the dependence of prisoners on external charity. It showed that survival was not guaranteed by law or authority but by the fragile kindness of families, churches, and guilds. Second, famine transformed the meaning of bread and water from accident to deliberate punishment, embedding hunger into judicial practice. Third, famine shaped cultural memory, reminding society of its failures. The nameless dead in prison yards became silent witnesses to injustice, haunting chronicles and wills. And finally, famine etched into the imagination the image of the prison as a place of death by hunger. This image persisted well beyond the Middle Ages, influencing how later generations understood confinement. When you think of famine, you likely imagine empty fields, hollow-cheeked villagers, or long lines at grain markets. Yet famine's most silent victims were often those behind bars, whose hunger went unseen. Their suffering revealed the fragility of justice, the cruelty of inequality, and the necessity of mercy. Prisons in famine years became a mirror of society, the powerful fed, the powerless starved. Hunger spoke louder than law, deciding who lived,